What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Hot Wax with Kurt Finn. This is episode 6. Welcome to the Duck Inn. On episode 6, we're going to be discussing an album that was released on February 22nd, 1971 on Atlantic Records by the great David Crosby and friends, called If I Could Only Remember My Name. It's a pretty cool record. It's David Crosby's first solo album. Of course, he found success with early on with the Byrds, and then briefly with the Buffalo Springfield, and also obviously Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. But went on to have a pretty good solo career outside of Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, and his own bands. This is kind of a neat record, when you discover it. I was really surprised that I didn't discover it till a lot later in my life, being, as much into a lot of the music that I was into, especially in high school, listening to, bands like, obviously, the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, these Woodstock bands, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, Santana, the band, Jimi Hendrix. I mean, it was just something that that we got into. So Crosby, Stills, Nash Young was a big part of my growing up, and obviously Neil Young was a huge part of my growing up. But Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, and getting into each member's vocal range and musicianship. You kind of realize all the different contributions that they made. So, Stephen Stills, had the Stephen Stills album, and Neil had released After the Gold Rush. And I think, Graham Nash did an album called Songs for Beginners, I believe it was. But, so all three of the, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young had a solo album. So it was kind of time for, it was time for, David to do an album, right? And unfortunately, at this time in 1970, 1971, they found obviously great success with Crosby, Stills, Nash Young in their first album, Deja Vu, and that. And each on their own. Buffalo Springfield was huge. The Byrds were huge. I think, Graham Nash and the Hollies. So, they came from kind of these big, type super groups. But it was time for David Crosby to make a solo album, and he needed a lot of help, with a lot of people. So a lot of people kind of rallied around him. This was kind of real shitty time, for lack of better words, for David Crosby. He was kind of down in the dumps. His drug addiction is always kind of, and his drug use is always kind of, been famous, but his girlfriend had just died, and he was kind of in some rocky relationships and dealing with a lot of stuff, and obviously how fucking big Crosby, Stills, Nash Young had gotten. It was out of control. But David Crosby was writing songs this whole time, and he kind of had his own material and kind of his own thing built up. But the one thing that was going on there, 1971. This is kind of a conglomerate of musicians. I think it was Paul Kantner. He also came out with an album. Here's an original copy. If I could only remember my name. But this album too, Blows Against the Empire. Okay, so. They called it the Planet Earth Rock and Roll Band, right? Or Rock and Roll Orchestra, the Planet Earth Rock and Roll Orchestra, which was basically the Grateful Dead, with the Jefferson Airplane and Joni Mitchell, backing up David Crosby. It was kind of a who's who, like back then, like if you know, right? It was like a who's who of Laurel Canyon, right? And kind of that San Francisco scene. Obviously, Jack Cassidy and Paul Kantner and Grace Slick of the Jefferson Airplane. Obviously, you had Jerry Garcia, Bill Kreutzmann, and Mickey Hart and Phil Lesh also playing bass on this record. And it's cool because it's right around the time a lot of guys were going to that Americana sound, right? You can definitely hear notes of Working Man's Dead, and the Grateful Dead's playing. You listen, like Phil's playing, and his backing band, is basically, the Dead, the Grateful Dead for many of the songs. And also, Paul Kantner and Jake. I mean, there was a lot of musicians on this band. That's why they called they kind of said this was an experimental record. And what they meant by that was this was a record that was recorded late nights, right? This is a late night love affair. You know what I mean? So like, for instance, there's a song of Jerry Garcia and Neil Young playing together, which are two of my favorite guitar players, and it's amazing to hear that song. The Cowboy Movie is one of my favorite songs I've ever heard, and it's funny, when I first heard it, I was like, "What the fuck is this?" And this I've got to be dreaming. But when they started recording this, it was just, like I said, it was kind of like late nights, and you're kind of throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. You know what I mean? Lyrically, you got everybody kind of, just kind of improvising, kind of jazz style, like making up lyrics as you go, making up the riff. You got the riff and just hitting the record button and then, overdubbing and just kind of experimenting that way vocally. So that's what kind of made this album really cool. You had a lot of the greatest musicians of the time. While David Crosby is kind of in a shitty time of his life, his fucking girlfriend just died, and he wants to record this record. So they go up to San Francisco, and they're in the Wally Heider studios. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, can you imagine just being a musician and like recording a record, and you like, hey, what's going on in the studio down here? Well, it's fucking Jerry Garcia, Neil Young, and Phil Lesh. I mean, it's the who's who of the music of the time. Obviously, post Woodstock. So they're in San Francisco, and Garcia's hanging out. Everybody's just hanging out, and they're just starting to record tracks. And the cool thing about it was it seemed like from listening to it, and the funny thing is I didn't start listening to this album until about 12 to 15 years ago. That's what I'm saying. Like, somebody, had played it for me, and I said, so what the fuck is this? It's like, well, this is, if I could only remember my name, David Crosby. And I was like, what, I've kind of heard of this, but, because Crosby, Stills, Nash Young had kind of brought back some of the songs, two of the songs from the album, Music is Love and like What Are Their Names? They were kind of playing those. It kind of brought them back, so I kind of knew. But I go out. First of all, I heard the record and it wasn't on vinyl, and I said I got to hear this on record. So immediately I go out, I get it on vinyl, and I bring it home, and just on a side story, if I may. I'd listened to this record and I was like, man, this is something. This is something. These are some of my favorite musicians. And one of my close friends, Ryan Grody, I was like, Ryan, he was living, back here in Illinois. And I said, Ryan, you got to come over. You got to come hear this record, man. And we listened to this record, and we couldn't believe the type of guys that we were, that how we listened to this music and how we loved bands like Jefferson. I mean, this was our shit. We couldn't believe that we had never heard of this record, and like I said, this about, 15 something, 12 years ago. So this is all we listened to, was this record. We start putting this on, and it's like, man, that's Jerry, that's Neil, that's Phil, that's everybody. I mean, this is everything that And Ryan kind of reminded me of David Crosby in a certain way. But, you know, it's an album, you know, to me that when, I mean, very influential to the Mississippi Stranglers for sure. You know, I mean, shit, this, I think after Neil and Paul and I started ingesting this album, uh, the Stranglers we kind of adopted the sound. We, you know, or went closer to it. You know. But when you think back, I mean, you know, when you first hear a record and that it's so familiar that you just, you know that you've been there, you know, but you don't know how you got there. But it's just so familiar, and then now it becomes part of you, and you kind of know exactly what the album means to you. And if I could only remember my name, I mean, like for me, like the search for it was pretty. You know, it was like, well, okay, I've got to find this on record, and I you know, I find it, and you know, I listening to it on the internet just didn't do it justice. You know, when I got it home on the vinyl turntable and put it on in the hi-fi speakers, you can really, I mean, for somebody that listens to all these type of bands as I do, and I'm sure that many of you do, you can actually sit down as a, you know, fan of Joni Mitchell's or Jefferson Airplane or the Grateful Dead or Santana, whatever it may be. You can hear those guys on this record. I mean, it's evident. And David Crosby is just so damn talented with his arrangements and with his vocals and his delivery. You know, I mean, a lot of the vocals, you know, as the story has it, were kind of made up on the spot. You know what I mean? And everything was kind of on the spot. You know, you kind of like vamped everything. You know, and then went back and maybe re-recorded it, whatever. But you know, it was all coming from an improvisational space. But it's, you know, that's what, you know, on Hot Vinyl, what it's all about. It's like the search also, like the search for this album for some people. You know, and unfortunately, it has become really available recently. So, you know, so you can get yourself a copy. I mean, you ought to get yourself this on vinyl if you're you know, somebody that just loves listening to warm, crisp perfection, you know, laid down on vinyl, man. And you know, the Wally Heider studio, and that was a place where, you know, a lot of guys recorded some good stuff. But the search for this record, unfortunately, has become a little bit easier. And I asked a friend of mine who's a, you know, professional record dealer. I, you know, was like, hey man, this album used to be, you know, impossible to find. Like what gives? You know, like why all of a sudden can you find this album at will? And he says, you know, Kurt, you know, time waits for no one, right? And a lot of the cats that bought this record, you know, and kept it close into their collection have passed on. So that's why you see kind of a lot of these original records kind of coming into circulation. And, you know, it's kind of funny to think that, you know, like, wow, you know, yeah, that's true. Like, this was a record that people didn't give up. This is something that you didn't go out and sell. You know, it was something that you held on to, you know what I mean? And now that we can find it, not a reissue, because the reissue, obviously, but, you know, finding an original copy is pretty amazing. Because a lot of the good ones have passed. So. But you can definitely hear Jerry Garcia's influence on it, and the pedal steel on the lead, and those things, and Neil Young, and obviously Phil Lesh's bass is all over this. You know, if you think about that time, you know, in Laurel Canyon, and then in San Francisco, you know, those guys were just, everybody would just sit around and write music. And everyone was starting to play on everybody's band, you know, on everybody's album. Everybody was starting to get together. And that's a camaraderie, you know, that as somebody who listens to music and who lives and breathes, you know, and dies it, you can hear that on this record. You can definitely hear the the family vibe of that time, of how those bands just stuck together. Uh, how close those San Francisco bands were, how close, LA, how close everybody was. They all looked up to each other. I mean, like Monterey Pop Music Festival was a big proof of that. You know, one of my favorite things about listening to hard to, not even hard to find vinyl, but like something that you search for, right? It's just it's this thing that you've got to have. Once you finally get it and you put it on the turntable, it really hits you and it moves you, man, and it doesn't go away. It stays in your collection until that day. For me, and like I mentioned before, Ryan and I started devouring this record, and wondered, Jesus, man, if we were 13, what would he have done? We would have lost our frickin' minds, man. I mean, we did when we were older and we heard it, but fuck, we would have lost our minds listening to Neil and Jerry and David Crosby playing together, just Billy. I mean, just everybody. I mean, it's Joni's back. I mean, it great. I mean, it's something. It is an album that I think that everybody, if you've listened to it, go back and listen to it. If you hadn't listened to it or given it enough time, you got to go back and you've got to, re-dig in. It's cool. One time I've seen Crosby, Stills, Nash and Crosby, Stills, Nash Young a couple times, and one time I went to go see Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I was in Phoenix, and I think it was fifth row, and I don't know how it happened, but I ended up getting fifth row, and they're playing a song off their new record, CSNY2K. They're playing a song called "Stand and Be Counted." And, being that close to the stage, I wasn't around a lot of people my type, you see. Maybe they were at one point, but they weren't then. They weren't digging it. So I, don't want to be bad. And that's another topic for another day. I don't want to be a bad concert person when you're sitting in the seat. I don't want to be that person. But this was an especially a great show for me. I was sitting, right in front of Neil and David Crosby, and just having a great show. And you know, many nights, man, many times that night, I'd locked eyes with Cros, and there was something so familiar, something so peaceful about looking at him, and everyone's kind of yelling at me, hey, sit down, sit down, sit down, we can't see. And I'm like, I understand that some of you might be a little bit older, but shit, man, I'm sorry, man. All right, I'll sit down, but man, just stand the fuck up. And then I got to the point where I couldn't sit down anymore. I'm standing, and I'm getting hollered at pretty good, But I was like, hey, man. And Cross, man, he looks right at me and he starts smiling and points at me and he says, "Hey, everybody, stand up for this one. Stand up. Let's go. You here? Stand up, stand up." And him and Nick kind of gave me the nod because finally people stood up because I stuck out pretty, but standing up, and they knew I was enjoying it. There's something about David Crosby, man. I mean, he had this, this glow about him, this look in his eye, these big wispy eyebrows, and it was incredible. And I think David Crosby was pretty damn incredible to write this record. This is one of the songs on this album, "Laughing" and "Cowboy Movie" and "What Are Their Names." But "Laughing" is a song that just has just blown me away. Year after year, I put this song on and I just can't get over it. How amazing it is. I mean, you can hear everything. I mean, this is just this again. I hate throwing around the word perfect, right? But this is as close to perfect as a record that you can get. Um, and you can definitely hear it. Like this is David Crosby kind of hunkering down in the studio and getting all tore up and hanging with his friends and experimenting and just making a record with his friends and giving it. You can feel that looseness. You can feel that honesty. I think, and you can feel the kindness and the warmth of the record too, and kind of you could tell which each of these bands were starting to go to this Americana sound, like the psychedelic sound had ended, and the Laurel Canyon thing, and the San Francisco. I mean, it was all kind of starting to go to this like Americana type sound, and I think this is one of the best records of those. Working Man's Dead's amazing, and After the Gold Rush, and Harvest. I mean, but the band too. I mean, you get into music from Big Pink. I mean, that was kind of what started a lot of guys. But I mean, this album is just incredible, and when you just read through the who's who of who played on this record, it's uh, amazing. I mean, the talent and what was going on when they were recording this. But for the time, I mean, it was, like I said, it's kind of a super group, man. I mean, a lot of people recorded at Hyder Studios too. So I mean, there was a familiarity with everybody getting together and kind of doing this thing. But you know, for what it's worth, it's David Crosby's first solo album. It's the Planet Earth Rock and Roll Orchestra. I mean, it's got the American Beauty thing. I mean, it's got the Harvest and Gold. I mean, it just was of the time, and it is a perfect record from front to back. I can't get enough of it. I love listening to it. I've got my David Crosby shirt on. I had a lot of fun listening back to it and playing it, and getting back into the lineup of everyone that played on the record. That's it right there, kids. That's about as good as it gets. So hope you go back and listen to this record, and really appreciate the work that David Crosby and friends did on this album. So thanks for coming to join me on episode 6 of Hot Wax with Kurt Finn. David Crosby, 1971, Atlantic Records. If I could only remember my name. It is definitely worth a second spin if you already own it. If you don't own it, it's worth picking it up and diving into it, because it'll blow your mind. And it's just one of my favorite all-time albums. So on episode 7, I'm not sure what direction I'm going to go. I'm going to kind of leave it up to chance. After listening to this record quite a few times and getting into the last couple of weeks of this record, I've really got to find something, because this is one of the tops. This is one of the best. This is one of the ones that you go out and find, and this is the ones that you spend time looking for. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do for episode 7 on the next album. But I thank everybody for all the watches and all the likes, and it's cool that people are watching it. So I guess I'll keep doing it and trying to make it a little bit better. But again, go out and get If I Can Only Remember My Name from David Crosby. It is such a great record, and there's really no bad day for it. Thanks for tuning in to Hot Wax and hanging out in the Duck Inn with me. Love what you spin what you love. Take care of one another. We'll see you on episode 7.